August 30th, 1944. 11:52 p.m. 8,000 feet above Saipan, the Pacific below a flat sheet of black glass. No moon, no horizon, no stars visible through a low ceiling of cloud. Lieutenant Isamu Kurita eases his aging bomber lower, throttling back until the engines are a whisper. Below him, an American airstrip sleeps under blackout discipline. Tents, fuel drums, sleeping men who trust the dark to hide them the way it always has. Kurita has flown this exact profile 11 times. Not once has an American fighter found him. The night has always belonged to him, and he has come to trust it the way a man trusts an old debt that never comes due. He does not know that 4 minutes ago, a shape with 2 tails and no lights climbed silently into a slow, deliberate orbit 600 feet above his flight path. Invisible, patient, already watching a small green duck crawl across a cracked glass screen inside its nose. That screen belongs to Lieutenant Daniel Voss, hunched in absolute blackness inside the belly of an aircraft most Americans have never heard of, staring at a piece of radar glass already scarred by one near miss with enemy flak weeks earlier. A crack running through the display like a vein of lightning frozen in place. He does not speak. He raises 2 fingers. Captain Thomas Halloran, in the seat ahead of him, eases the throttles forward without a word. The image most people carry of American air power in the Pacific is daylight. Chrome yellow tracers, blue skies, a P-51 rolling triumphantly past the wing of a bomber it just saved. That image is real, but it is incomplete. It leaves out the 11 hours of every 24 when the sky belonged, until this moment, entirely to the enemy, when no American aircraft could see and no American gunner could aim, and the only defense against a night raid was hope. This is the story of the machine built to end that helplessness, and of the men who had never fought this way before, hunting an enemy they could not see, using nothing but a fractured piece of glass and their trust in each other. Chapter 1. Before the Black Widow existed, night belonged entirely to whoever chose to fly through it uncontested. Captain Thomas Halloran had transferred into the newly formed night fighter program from conventional day fighters, and the adjustment was not aerodynamic. It was psychological. A day pilot fights an enemy, he can see the instant he closes to gun range. A night fighter pilot fights an enemy who exists only as a voice in his headset, a set of coordinates read off a screen by a man he cannot see, sitting 8 feet behind him in total darkness. The idea for the aircraft itself had been born out of desperation. During the Blitz, British cities burned nightly, while Fighter Command watched helplessly, unable to intercept bombers hidden by the one thing no gun or engine could defeat. American planners studying those reports understood immediately that daylight superiority meant nothing if the enemy simply waited for sunset. What they needed was not a faster fighter. They needed an aircraft that could see in a medium where sight itself did not exist. One that carried its own eyes on board, independent of moonlight, independent of searchlights, independent of luck. Northrop's answer was strange to look at and stranger to fly. Twin tail booms. A bulbous, radar-packed nose that gave the aircraft the silhouette of something assembled rather than designed. Pilots who transferred in from sleek single-engine fighters openly mocked it on first sight, calling it a flying boxcar, joking that it looked like something built to deliver mail rather than death. Halloran remembered standing on the flight line the first time he saw one up close, and thinking privately that no aircraft this ungainly could possibly be fast enough to catch anything in the dark. He was wrong, and the correction came quickly. Loaded for combat, the Black Widow could still exceed 360 miles per hour, fast enough to run down bombers that had spent 2 years believing nothing could touch them at night. That single fact would matter more than its appearance ever could, because in the sky above the Pacific, silhouette meant nothing to a radar operator reading a blip on a screen. Only speed, and what waited behind it, would decide who lived until dawn. Chapter 2. The heart of the Black Widow was not its engines or its 420mm cannons. It was the SCR-720 radar set buried in its nose, a British-derived system that gave Voss the ability to detect an enemy aircraft up to 5 miles away in conditions where the human eye was functionally useless beyond arm's length. 5 miles sounds small stated as a number. Translated into consequence, it meant an aircraft that had never once been caught in over a dozen missions could now be found, tracked, and closed upon before its crew ever knew they were being hunted. Voss had trained for months on ground-based simulators before ever flying combat, learning to read a cluttered, flickering scope the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, separating signal from static, distinguishing a genuine target from cloud return or sea clutter. It was tedious, exhausting work performed in total isolation. No window, no horizon, nothing but a small green circle of light, and his own concentration standing between his pilot and a collision with an enemy neither of them could see with their own eyes. The scope itself had already been damaged once, weeks before this mission, when a piece of anti-aircraft shrapnel had punched through the nose section during a low-altitude pass over a contested airstrip. The impact had cracked the glass directly across the display, and the crew chief, working through the night with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, had rigged a strip of medical gauze across the fracture to keep it from spreading further, muttering that it would hold if nobody looked at it too hard. Voss had looked at it every single mission since. He had learned to read targets around the crack the way a man learns to read a letter with half the words torn away. This was the unglamorous truth behind the machine. Not gleaming new equipment, but exhausted men trusting damaged instruments because there was no time to wait for perfect ones. Somewhere over the black water below them, Kurita's bomber droned on, confident in a darkness he did not yet know had already been broken. Chapter 3. At first, the Japanese pilots flying night raids across the Pacific dismissed American night fighters as a rumor invented to explain bad luck. Kurita himself, early in the campaign, had told his crew after one uneventful mission that American night defenses were, in his words, blind dogs barking at shadows, confident that no aircraft could track him through cloud, through darkness, through the electronic silence he had always flown in. That confidence was not arrogance without reason. For nearly 2 years, Japanese night raiders had operated with almost total impunity across the Pacific theater, striking airfields, fuel depots, and anchored shipping under cover of darkness, while American anti-aircraft crews fired blindly at engine sound alone, rarely scoring a hit. The nightly raids earned a bitter nickname among exhausted American ground troops, Washing Machine Charlie, after the uneven, droning engine rhythm that returned night after night, like a chore no one could avoid. But something strange was happening in those skies that Kurita had not yet been briefed on. 3 raids in the preceding month had simply vanished. Bombers that took off, radioed routine position reports, and never returned, with no anti-aircraft fire reported near their last known coordinates. Ground observers heard nothing. No searchlights had engaged. No flak batteries claimed credit. It was as though the darkness itself had begun quietly consuming aircraft that had trusted it completely for 2 years. Rumors began moving through Japanese airbases of a strange twin-tailed shape glimpsed for half a second by a wounded tailgunner before his aircraft went down, a shape with no forward lights, moving with terrible precision, as if it had known exactly where to be before anyone aboard the bomber understood they were even under attack. Kurita heard these stories and dismissed them as battle fatigue. He had flown 11 missions without incident. He saw no reason the 12th would be different. Chapter 4. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron operated under conditions that tested every assumption pilots had carried over from daylight combat. There was no formation flying, no wingman visible off the wingtip for reassurance, no horizon to orient a disoriented pilot pulling out a dive. Every mission was flown essentially alone. A single aircraft and a two-man crew suspended in a black void, dependent entirely on instruments, radio discipline, and the fragile trust between a pilot who flew the aircraft and an operator who alone could see what was actually out there. Halloran had come to rely on Voss's voice the way a blind man relies on a hand on his shoulder. Early missions had been marked by false alarms. Cloud returns mistaken for aircraft, friendly patrol boats briefly flagged as targets before visual confirmation corrected the error. Each mistake carried real weight, because closing on a false target wasted fuel and time that could not be recovered over open ocean, and because a misidentified friendly aircraft could end in tragedy that no crew wanted to carry home. On the night of August 30th, for minutes after climbing into their intercept pattern, Voss's voice came through the intercom flat and controlled despite what the moment demanded. Single contact, bearing 220, range 4 miles, closing slow. Halloran adjusted heading without visual reference to anything beyond his instruments, trusting a voice in the dark completely, because trusting anything else was not an option available to him. This was the mission that would matter more than either man yet understood. Not because of what waited at the end of it, but because of the raw, unglamorous discipline required simply to get there. No searchlights swept the sky to help them. No ground control vectored them precisely on a target. There was only the cracked green glow of a damaged scope, and two men who had learned, mission by mission, to believe in it completely. Chapter 5. 2 miles out, still with no visual contact whatsoever, Halloran began the intercept the same way he had trained for months to perform it, trusting Voss's called headings completely, adjusting throttle and heading by voice alone while his eyes searched a black sky that offered him nothing. This was the moment that separated night interception from every kind of aerial combat that had existed before radar. The complete absence of the enemy from human vision until the very last seconds, replaced entirely by numbers, headings, and a disembodied voice describing a threat that remained, until almost the point of firing, purely theoretical. At 1 mile, Voss's voice tightened only slightly. Contact confirmed, single-engine bomber profile, altitude matching, close to weapons range. Halloran eased the throttles back to avoid overshooting in the dark, a maneuver requiring a discipline that ran directly against every instinct built by daylight dogfighting, where closing speed and aggression won engagements. Here, patience won engagements. A pilot who rushed a night intercept risked flying directly past his target in the dark without ever seeing it, burning fuel and losing the one advantage radar had given him. At 600 yards for the first time, Halloran saw it. Not a silhouette against the sky, but a slightly darker shape against slightly less dark cloud, betrayed only by the faint blue glow of exhaust stacks. Kurita's aircraft, still flying its familiar, confident profile, still trusting a darkness it did not know had already failed it completely. Halloran did not fire immediately. He closed another 100 yards because a night kill required certainty no daylight engagement ever demanded. There would be no second look, no visual confirmation of markings, only the shape, the exhaust glow, and Voss's radar data agreeing completely that this was the target and nothing else sharing this stretch of black sky with them. Chapter 6. Halloran fired a 4-second burst from the P-61's battery of 20mm cannons, and in the total darkness the effect was almost obscene in its violence. A sudden eruption of orange light, where seconds before there had been only formless black, illuminating for 1/2 second the full outline of Kurita's bomber before it fell away, trailing fire into the water below. Voss, watching his scope, saw the blip that had occupied his screen for the past 6 minutes simply disappear, replaced by nothing at all. There was no cheering in the cockpit. There rarely was on night missions. The engagement had been too clinical, too dependent on instruments and discipline rather than the visible, visceral drama of a daylight dogfight, for either man to feel anything resembling triumph in the immediate aftermath. What Halloran felt instead, banking back toward Saipan through renewed darkness, was something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who had trusted a piece of cracked glass and a voice in his headset completely, and had been right too. Kurita did not survive the engagement. What is known, drawn from wreckage recovery and squadron records compiled afterward, is that his aircraft went down roughly 4 miles offshore, its crew given no warning beyond perhaps a half-second glimpse of tracer fire before the aircraft was already breaking apart around them. There would be no 11th confident diary entry from him about blind dogs barking at shadows. The darkness that had protected him for 2 years had, on this night, simply stopped cooperating. Behind him, in briefing rooms across the Japanese-held Pacific, the story would spread differently than it had before. No longer dismissed as fatigue or rumor, but repeated now with genuine unease among crews who had trusted the night the way Kurita once had. Something was changing in the sky, and the men flying through it every evening had begun, for the first time, to feel afraid of the dark itself. Chapter 7. As losses accumulated through the autumn of 1944, the tone among Japanese night bomber crews shifted from confident dismissal to something closer to superstition. Reports began circulating of aircraft sensed rather than seen. Crews claiming they could feel when they were being hunted, describing an instinct that told them something was closing on them from directions their eyes could offer no confirmation of. One surviving pilot, debriefed after ditching near a contested island, described the sensation as flying inside a locked room with someone circling outside it, tapping occasionally on the walls just to remind him he was not alone. This was not mysticism. It was the psychological toll of facing an enemy who could locate you with total confidence while you possessed no equivalent means of locating them. An asymmetry that daylight combat had never produced, because daylight combat always offered at least the dignity of seeing your opponent before you died. Night interception denied even that. Crews began flying evasive, unpredictable altitude changes not because doctrine called for it, but because unpredictability felt, however irrationally, like the only defense remaining against a threat that seemed to know exactly where they were regardless. The statistics accumulating quietly behind these missions carried weight that went far beyond aircraft destroyed. Every successful interception meant an airfield that did not burn that night, meant ground crews who slept instead of running for cover, meant supply lines that continued functioning instead of absorbing another loss that could not be quickly replaced 8,000 miles from a nearest factory. 6 confirmed night kills by the squadron in a 6-week stretch does not read, on paper, as an overwhelming number. Translated into consequence, it meant 6 nights when fields the Marines depended on for their own survival woke up intact instead of in ashes. Halloran and Voss flew 11 more missions that autumn together, their trust in each other and in their damaged, gauze-patch scope deepening with every successful intercept, even as fatigue accumulated in a way that no official report ever fully captured, because exhaustion, unlike aircraft losses, was never a number anyone chose to write down. Chapter 8. Not every mission ended cleanly. In late September, a second crew from the same squadron, pilot Lieutenant Walter Sims and radar operator Sergeant Earl Pratt, launched into a similar intercept profile against a reported contact northeast of their base, only to lose radar contact entirely 11 minutes into the pursuit when their own set failed without warning, the scope going dark exactly at the moment the target should have entered visual range. Sims had one specific personal reason for wanting this particular mission to succeed that had nothing to do with squadron statistics. His brother had been aboard a transport ship damaged in a night raid 3 weeks earlier, surviving with injuries serious enough to end his own service, and Sims had privately promised himself he would not let another ship burn on his watch if he could prevent it. Flying blind after equipment failure, with the enemy bomber somewhere ahead in total darkness and no instrument left to locate it, Sims made the decision to continue the intercept using dead reckoning alone. Estimated heading, estimated closing speed, and nothing else. He never found the target that night. The bomber completed its run against a fuel depot near the coast, and Sims returned to base having burned nearly all his reserve fuel chasing a contact he never confirmed visually, landing with barely enough margin to avoid a dead-engine approach in the dark. He wrote nothing dramatic in his post-mission report. He simply noted equipment failure, contact lost, and requested the radar set be prioritized for repair before the next scheduled flight. The depot burned that night specifically because a machine failed at the wrong moment, a fact that offered no comfort to the men stationed there, who watched fuel reserves they depended on go up in flame, while the aircraft meant to prevent it circled uselessly overhead. It was a reminder, delivered without ceremony, that the Black Widow's dominance over the dark was earned mission by mission and could be lost in a single moment of mechanical failure that no amount of crew skill could compensate for. Chapter 9. By early 1945, something had shifted decisively in the psychological balance of the night skies above the contested Pacific. Squadrons flying the Black Widow across multiple theaters had accumulated a body of confirmed night interceptions substantial enough that Japanese command began altering bomber tactics specifically to avoid known night fighter patrol zones, a tacit admission that the darkness could no longer be trusted the way it once had been, that an entire tactical doctrine built around the assumption of nighttime invisibility had quietly failed. The aircraft itself, over the course of the war, would be credited with well over 100 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed across the Pacific and European theaters combined. 100 sounds, on its own, like a modest figure compared to the daylight totals racked up by fighters flying in far greater numbers. Translated into consequence, each of those 100-odd kills represented a specific raid that did not reach its target, a specific airfield or ship or column of men on open ground that woke up the next morning intact rather than counting losses, a specific set of families somewhere in Japan who would eventually receive notice their son had simply failed to return, without ever understanding precisely why the darkness he had trusted had betrayed him. This was the closest the campaign came to what might be called its patriotic climax. Not a single dramatic battle, but the quiet, accumulating proof that American engineering had solved a problem the entire world had assumed unsolvable. For 2 years, night had been the one domain where technological superiority meant nothing, where the most advanced air force in the world was reduced to firing blindly at engine sound. The Black Widow ended that. It did not win the war by itself. It closed a door that had been left open since the war began, and closing it meant that for the remainder of the conflict, no combatant on either side could assume darkness would protect them indefinitely again. Halloran, reflecting on this period decades later in a recorded veterans interview, would describe the feeling simply. The fear had not disappeared from night missions, but it had changed shape from the fear of an enemy who could always find you, to the fear that came from being the one now doing the finding and having to live with what that meant. Chapter 10. The war's end came suddenly for an aircraft that had been built for a very specific kind of darkness that, once solved, no longer needed solving in the same way. Within 3 years of the surrender, the Black Widow was almost entirely retired from frontline service, replaced by early jet-power night fighters carrying radar systems that made the SCR-720 look, by comparison, primitive. Fewer than 700 have been built in total. A modest number for combat aircraft is stated cleanly, and translated honestly, it means an aircraft that never had the chance to become a household name the way the Mustang or the Flying Fortress did, despite having solved a problem neither of those legendary aircraft ever had to face. Most surviving airframes were scrapped through the late 1940s and 1950s, cut apart for aluminum in the same post-war drawdown that claimed thousands of other aircraft considered obsolete the moment peace made their specific purpose unnecessary. The men who had flown it scattered into civilian life, carrying a form of combat experience almost nobody they met afterward could relate to. There was no glamorous mythology built around night interception the way there was for daylight dogfighting, no widely circulated gun camera footage of tracers arcing across a visible enemy fighter. Because nearly everything the Black Widow crews had done had happened in darkness no camera of the era could capture. Voss, in later years, kept almost nothing from his service beyond a single small fragment of cracked radar scope glass, salvaged quietly from the aircraft before it was finally retired, kept in a drawer for decades without much comment to family about what exactly it represented. Halloran flew commercial aircraft for another 2 decades after the war, rarely discussing his night fighter service except with other veterans of the same small, specialized community who understood without needing lengthy explanation what it had meant to fight an enemy you could not see, using nothing but trust in a machine and in each other. The squadron itself was quietly deactivated, its records filed away in archives that few historians outside dedicated aviation researchers ever consulted, the aircraft itself fading from public memory almost as completely as the darkness it had once conquered. Chapter 11. Today, one of the last surviving Black Widows rests inside a museum hangar, its twin-tail booms and bulbous radar nose drawing curious, but often uncertain looks from visitors who frequently mistake it, at first glance, for some kind of transport aircraft rather than the deadliest night hunter of its era. Mounted in a small display case near the nose section sits a single fragment of radar scope glass, its cracks still visible after 8 decades, the light behind it switched off permanently, the crew who once depended on it completely long since gone. The runway complex on Saipan, where Halloran and Voss once launched into total darkness, has been partially reclaimed by jungle growth. Sections of cracked coral concrete, still visible beneath vegetation to anyone who knows precisely where to look. The same strip that once launched aircraft into a night sky that no longer belongs to anyone in particular. Quiet now in a way it never was during those months when it represented the fragile line between an airfield that survived until morning and one that did not. One genuine mystery remains undocumented in official squadron records. Several night intercepts credited to the unit during this period lack complete corresponding wreckage confirmation from Japanese sources, meaning a small number of claimed kills, including possibly Kurita's exact final mission details, rest on American radar and gun camera evidence alone, with the enemy's own final radio transmissions, if any were made, never recovered or matched to surviving Japanese unit records. Historians studying both sides of this specific campaign have never fully reconciled the discrepancy, leaving open the small but genuine possibility that at least one of these confirmed victories describes an aircraft whose true fate, to this day, was never definitively confirmed by the side that lost it. The darkness that Kurita once trusted completely, and that Halloran and Voss spent months learning to conquer, no longer holds any secrets that matter tactically. But it still holds this one, small and unresolved, exactly the way the war left it, a single cracked piece of glass in a museum case, and a handful of missions from 80 years ago whose final truth was buried, quite literally, at the bottom of the Pacific, along with the men who never got the chance to explain what actually happened to them that night.